Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we're interviewing Sean Bennett, CTO and co-founder of Stronghold. Stronghold is a leading financial infrastructure company that provides fast, secure, and accessible financial services through a simple API. Sean, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only to learn about your background, your experience, but also what's so exciting and typically just like what's changing and evolving in the digital currency in space and really, and from a infrastructural standpoint, what it's going to mean to those who are maybe not avid users or not currently using products that deal with digital currency, but this infrastructure layer that's really going to allow other technologies to really reach huge mass audience is really exciting to me and our audience on how, what's being built, how's it currently, where it is in this life cycle and process, but also what it's going to mean in terms of the different partnerships and companies you're working with. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
And thanks very much for having me on, Julian. Before co-founding Stronghold, I mean, my journey to getting into this business really started back in 2011. I was at medical school at the time, thought I wanted to be a doctor, right? That very different pathway. And Bitcoin came into my mind when I saw it being used as a donation mechanism for WikiLeaks because Visa and MasterCard had dropped it, right? And I saw, okay, there's got this new programmable currency is really how I saw it at the time, right? While I was at med school, I was actually contracting as a software developer to pay the bills, right? And also learn some skills. And I thought that was really interesting. But it wasn't until a few years later that the technology started to evolve and we started to see traditional currencies start moving on top of blockchain technology. And that was super interesting because, hey, we're still using US dollar, New Zealand dollar, Australian dollar, whatever it happened to be. And so when I saw that starting to happen, I really jumped in and I started my own startup at that time. So I took a research year at med school so I could have a bit more free time. And I started building on top of the technology using those skills I had built up sort of freelancing as a software dev.
Yeah, the evolution a little bit more. What in particular was exciting about seeing the adaptability of, say, classical currency into digital currency? What's that relationship that people may not know of in terms of how the value might change in a digital economy versus in a physical economy that we're typically used to?
So the thing I was always interested in was remittance because I have my mother's side of the family lives in the Philippines. And so I was always seeing that sort of transfer of value across borders over there and also cross currency.
Yeah.
And I think the hard thing about digital currency when it comes to cryptocurrency, so Bitcoin, Ether, some alternative currency is that you're sort of introducing a new behavior because there's this extra step of transfer where you have this new currency that people still aren't aware of. And I think that for a lot of people, especially in the software tech world, I think our heads are already sort of over Bitcoin or whatever it is, and we sort of forget that there's this extra step. But the rest of the world, the consumers who really need it, they don't need that extra sort of mental block of, oh, there's this extra digital currency that I need to think about. How do I deal with storing that? What does that mean? Are there extra regulations around that? So when the infrastructure for moving that digital currency started to be applied to the sovereign currencies that everyone knows and understands and uses today, that was the big difference for me, right?
Yeah.
Because you're eliminating that extra step, but you still have the ability to be able to transfer it across borders and be able to get rid of intermediary parties because of that blockchain digital nature, but it's still, call it US dollar, Philippine peso, whatever it needs to be.
Yeah.
So that was the really interesting thing, 2013, 2014, that we started seeing changing. And that's why I jumped in.
Yeah. And how do you do that from a mechanical standpoint in tying a physical currency, say USD to USDC, when in relationship to, say, things around inflation? Bitcoin, there's only a certain amount minted, so there only will be a certain amount. I think Dogecoin was the first one to actually create this mechanism that more will be kind of created as as the environment kind of grows. But what does it mean in relationship to like USD, inflation, and having a currency that maybe is it more or less volatile? What's that relationship, and what can we expect in terms of your predictions of I guess, stable currencies?
Yeah. So what I was doing back in 2013 and 14 is very similar to how most of the stablecoins that people interact with today, how they work today. And that really it's pretty basic. It's you sort of send, let's say, $100 into a bank account that the stablecoin issuer, if it's USDC, it would be Circle, holds in a bank account, and they're basically giving you an IOU on top of a blockchain. And then you can transfer that as if it was the same as a digital dollar. And then eventually someone else can bring that IOU back to Circle and say, okay, I want this back. I want a dollar denominated wire to get the money back out of the blockchain.
Mm.
So that's really how that's working. So in terms of thinking about the economics of how the coin works, it really is just a US dollar. Now, granted, there's some complications there, and we've seen that recently play out with some of the banks going down. And okay, where is the money behind the USDC stored? And that was a big problem, right? They did have money at, I think, two of the banks that recently were closed and taken over by the FDIC. And temporarily, the price of that stablecoin went under $1 for a certain amount of time, right? Obviously a problem. So I think that what I'm particularly excited about, and a lot of other people in the space are sort of polarized on, is what does it look like when the government starts to issue those sort of coins, right?
Yeah.
Or it's not a deposit at a bank, it's actually on a Fed account somewhere. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then it really is truly a US dollar at that stage.
Yeah. And what does that mean in terms of you bring in the currency into the digital economy, and then you're able to send money and do these transactions at a really kind of unprecedented speed? What does that mean for people who say are typically have barriers transferring money? Say my family's from Mexico and I wanted to transfer money to them, and now I'm able to do it in the digital economy. What does that mean for how quickly currency and money can be transferred, but also the previous barriers, which was like converting and having kind of all those fees around that conversion percentage and things like that? What does that change in terms of that kind of experience?
I think the biggest one is removal of sort of all the intermediary parties that generally are involved in a transaction. That was the big original one. Like if you were trying to send money via wire overseas, you'd have all these correspondent banks in the way, and each of them are taking a clip, right? In fact, moving to the US, I'm surprised at how expensive wires still are to get money out of this country. Thankfully, you don't have to use them now. We've got some great services, like even Western Union's picked up with its digital transformation and TransferWise. They're all doing a great job, but you're still really reliant on those parties to be controlling most of the system. The really nice thing about having these digital currencies is you don't have to rely on one business or one business that has relationships to process your entire transaction. You can sort of choose a way to get into the network. You can transact within that network freely. The control is in your hands. If you're using your own digital wallet, you could even have custody of the tokens of your money, right? You're controlling it all. And then you can pick any sort of service to get it back out to the traditional world. And hopefully over time, the blockchain dream is that the sort of getting money in and out becomes less and less common because more of the economy is connected to that sort of decentralized layer, right? So it should get better over time is the hope for people in the industry.
Yeah. And for the audience to get a little bit more context here, describe Stronghold, what the product is, and how you're essentially helping your customers solve a fairly particular problem.
Yeah, so Stronghold's vision and mission are really around providing financial services for all. So access for all is really what we're thinking about. And earlier on in our journey, we were really heavily looking at remittance because both myself and my co-founder, it's what we really cared about coming into the space. But over time, what we realized was a lot of the problems were really, really close to home here in the domestic US. There's still certain parts of industries that are underbanked and unable to receive financial services. That could be as basic as access to bank accounts, payments on top of that, and then other things like access to capital. And so what we decided to target, using blockchain technology, but still everything's tied to US dollar most of the time, is looking at those underserved niche industries, right? Where there might be higher regulations or it's harder to get banked, and providing services to them. So we provide payments and access to capital for generally small to medium business that work in restricted spaces. So there's sort of like an age restriction on a product, or it might be a license, like in the gaming or gambling industries. We're able to help those customers. So that's the niche we play in.
And describe what that means in terms of giving people access to capital who are underserved, whether it's because of their background experience, maybe credit score. There's so many things that I think miss in the underwriting process traditionally that doesn't allow people to get this access. But now that they're able to even transact at a higher volume, what does that mean for those entrepreneurs to grow and scale their business and really think about their opportunity rather than trying to kind of survive in an ecosystem where not a lot is set up for you to have success if you don't have, say, a lump sum of capital or an amazing kind of underwriting kind of credit history? What does that mean for people?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of about what we're doing at Stronghold. And I'm also most excited about is the different way that we underwrite some of our products, right?
Yeah.
We work with entrepreneurs who do have spotty or colorful backgrounds, right? But we can look past that and understand the totality of the journey they've gone on, understanding that some of the industries we serve, just the fact that they were in those industries used to be illegal, right?
Yeah.
And so we can work past that and look at what's changed, where they're trying to head to, and keep moving forward with them. So even just giving them access to payments often is a huge step forward for them instead of just having to use cash 100% of the time, right? So, okay, now we get them on board with digital payments. It's a lot easier to track. That actually can help them get access to traditional bank accounts, right? Because the banks are seeing, oh, you're working with a trusted party in Stronghold, and we can see a lot of your transactions are now going through a digital payment method, and we can actually see where that money's coming from, right? It sort of continues to snowball. But then, because we have access to the data of their payments, we're able to very easily underwrite things like cash advances to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now let's get really interesting, and we're able to provide our merchant customers with, it could be as simple as having more inventory so that they can expand a delivery operation, all the way to, okay, we're actually ready to start opening new locations, but we've got good cash flow, but it's a huge upfront cost. So we can start giving them the funds there to grow from a small operation with one store to multiple locations. That's a huge step change for these people. And they can't go into a bank and ask for a loan.
Yeah.
So it's really transformative for them. So that's really what I'm excited about us doing.
And what does it mean for, say, transacting globally differently from what it's been traditionally, whether it's actually, say, there's all these platforms, say like Fiverr, for instance, Fiverr get a developer or a Webflow developer, and everything's kind of transacted through Webflow. So I don't really have to think about a lot of that. But if I'm a small business who, say, wants to interact and, say, expand globally, whether I have a particular service or product, what does that mean for my ability to access and payments and capital quickly with my customers for how I can grow and expand my business? Do we see, is the technology sophisticated enough to be able to really make an impact there? Or are we still a little bit behind on that mark?
Yeah. So Stronghold really focuses on domestic payments in the US. However, a lot of the technologies we're interacting with really do allow for much easier international acceptance of funds, because if you've got, say, USDC on top of a blockchain like Ethereum, it doesn't really matter where those funds are coming from anymore, right?
Yeah.
They're coming from the blockchain. If you're built to that, it doesn't matter if it's someone sending them from New Zealand, Argentina, Japan. It no longer matters. I think that the biggest issue that we still have in getting to that sort of utopia of accepting payments from everywhere is, well, I've just sent an invoice to someone. How do they get money into the system? It's the on and off ramps that are still really difficult. And even here in the US, it looks like that we're having a problem with on ramps because of the recent banking failures. So that's still something that hasn't been solved a decade later.
Yeah. Yeah. What was interesting and something I didn't really know about, and maybe I don't know if our audience knows, but you have this really interesting partnership with IBM that allows you to kind of partner with them in their technology, and describe how that, in terms of the IBM technology, how that's really allowed what you've been able to do, build what you've been able to build, kind of had that's kind of that relationship is versus, say, the traditional ways that we know about blockchain, which is Coin, Ethereum helps you build off and use their infrastructure. But what is the difference between this partnership and what's been exciting about working with a company like IBM to build out financial tools and infrastructure?
Yeah. So the IBM Worldwire project was really about helping remittance companies and financial institutions sort of settle their books with each other on a regular basis, right? So instead of having to do it the old fashioned way, which was going to be working with correspondent banks in the process, slow, expensive, they would be able to do it in a more real time fashion and directly with each other, right? And there could still be some consolidation of how the settlement works, but it allowed for party to party settlement. So they'd have your, let's just say, consumers might be trying to send money from the US to the Philippines. Everything looks normal there. And these are existing remittance companies. So they're doing this day to day already. However, instead of having to settle funds the old way, they would use blockchain essentially. And so we created Stronghold USD, which was a stablecoin that works very similarly to, say, USDC Circle. And they would use that as their settlement vehicle. And so that was the big difference there. It was changing their back-end operations without having to introduce any new behavioral change to the consumer. And I think that's really important. I think the most successful projects are going to look like that. You won't notice them happening necessarily, right?
Yeah.
There were efficiencies that they could pass through to the customer. So that's really what that one was about.
Yeah. And what in particular does this change in terms of the paradigm of the pressure that's now being put on like traditional large legacy financial institutions to be able to become more digitally native and faster and have more kind of advanced technology? What does that change in the last 5 years or more or less in terms of that pressure that's being pushed onto them, seeing that people are kind of ready to either, if they don't evolve and advance and allow all these abilities that say other technology that maybe quote unquote a little bit more risky or non-traditional, but they're ready to kind of jump ship and go into these other means. How have you seen these institutions kind of take on that pressure and evolve? And what is what is your prediction to how they'll continue to evolve?
Yeah, I think over the last 5 years, we've seen a big push for larger FI, institutional style FI, sort of accelerators and pitching contests. They really are doing, I think, a good job because of how big they and how slow they might be to move, of trying to understand what's happening out there with entrepreneurs and fintechs. I think acquisition will become a lot more important, but I think, and maybe because of what we did with IBM, these sort of internal teams building out essentially what is a startup.
Yeah.
I think we'll see a lot more of that coming up because there's been some issues with some recent acquisitions into the larger companies. I think we'll see their internal teams starting to build out more of this capability. I think they're ready to start doing that more. So I think that's what we'll see.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the traction that you've seen at Stronghold. What has been exciting about what you've built up to this point, the amount of users and customers and partners that you've been able to accumulate and really add value to, but what's particularly exciting about the next phase of Stronghold and what you're looking forward to start building on?
One of the things I really like about what we're doing at the moment is the fact that we sort of have one foot in the traditional world, right? Most of our customers don't need to know about the fact our other foot is in the crypto world.
Sure.
Right. So we do a lot of, I think, bridging between those two worlds. We take value from things like blockchain and decentralized finance, especially, and that's what I'm really excited about. And then we pass the value back through to our traditional customers, giving them interfaces that they'd expect at a more traditional bank, really. So growth on, say, the decentralized finance side is what I think we'll start to see more and more of, and that's really what I'm excited for. A little bit, maybe some road bumps on the way, right? The crypto market is a little bit down. That doesn't really matter to us, except the fact that it sort of means interest is a little bit lower. But the players that are going to be around long term, there's quite a few of them there, and we're just happy that they continue to build because we can leverage that. But that's really where I think most of our growth will be in the future, taking that value and bringing it back to traditional market.
Yeah. Whether it's external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that Stronghold faces today?
One of the biggest risks for us, one of the biggest things to navigate has to be regulation, right? We are very focused on North America, particularly the US. And as we see playing out right now, some interesting movements by the government on financial institutions that were really holding up access to crypto inside the US.
Yeah.
So we've always got our eyes on that. We do have presence in overseas entities as well, which gives us a little bit of flexibility. And that's one of the ways that we sort of mitigate things. But really staying ahead of regulation is super important to us. So I think that most of the moves we've made have looked really conservative, especially to other people in the crypto space. And that's because we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is sustainable, given that regulations could change at any time. And I sort of agree with the chair of the SEC at the moment that the regulation or the legislation is sufficient to cover crypto today. It's just really in the application.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest thing that's in our mind whenever we're launching a new product or doing anything, just making sure we're safe from that point of view.
Yeah. And we hear a lot of kind of reasons behind regulation and how it limits and things along that nature. But what are some of the benefits that you see in this kind of within crypto, at least? And we've obviously heard some bad news with bad actors but all that behavior was not crypto forward. It's just kind of human behavior mostly.
Right.
But what's been kind of, I guess, beneficial about the regulations that you're seeing and how will that help consumers at least maybe even trust digital currency more so?
Yeah, it's really going to come down to interpretation, giving everyone in the industry really clear interpretation of how the current rules apply, and then just making sure they're actually followed. I think that the regulations, especially when it comes to consumer protection, are pretty good. They're really good. They're there for a point. They've worked previously, as the SEC keeps telling us,
Yeah.
and they're there for a reason. And a lot of these recent failures, you're absolutely right. It has nothing to do with
Yeah.
the crypto industry as such. It really is just people and greed a lot of the time. So I'm generally pro-regulation, which is not a thing people want to hear a lot of the time in this space. But the best thing it can give businesses are guide rails. Okay, here are your guide rails. You know how to operate. Here's some clear guidance, and this is how we'll enforce it. That's really all we need. And that last bit, clarity and how we'll enforce it, I think that's the bit we're still missing.
Yeah, yeah. I think consumers a lot of times think it'll affect them, but like you mentioned, I think it's a lot about the structure of business, how they should perform, and what should they be guided by. Which, from a consumer at least, that gives me some kind of confidence in that things should be at a certain standard, right? It's why we go to certain restaurants versus others. It's why we really choose certain products over another as well. Is what our expectations are for that interaction and involvement. If in a perfect world, if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Stronghold?
I just wanted to add a little bit onto that.
Yeah,
You done something really good with the consumer choice.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important. The consumer, especially when it comes to crypto and blockchain, will always have the ability to choose the more regulated, domestic looking, slightly more centralized service that has those protections. But there'd probably still be a way for them to access the more decentralized services. They might on-ramp through one that's regulated and then go to, it's a decentralized organization running something. So I hope that they will still have access to that, but it should very much be opt-in, right?
Yeah.
You're going to opt in through that sort of more Wild West world, to put it one way, and access the benefits and the cons that you might get of doing that. So
Yeah.
choice. We can still have choice even with regulation.
Yeah, I love that. And then, long-term vision, if everything goes well, what does that look like?
I think for us at Stronghold, it's continuing to broaden the audience that we're able to serve, right? We're all about financial access for all, and it's expanding that both at markets that we serve, so geographies, right? It would be great to be going back international. We've been making some inroads into Canada, but still very close to home. But it would be great to go properly international again. And I think the other one is more industries, serving more industries, right? We went very niche in COVID to solve a particular use case, and that was really good.
Yeah.
That we got good penetration there. The customer base loves us because we were really needed. But I think we're getting to a point where we're ready to start expanding out of that again, given the revenues that we've generated to give us a bit of boost for growth. So that's really what we're doing. And I think trying to find more uses for DeFi over time, decentralized finance.
Yeah.
So we do cash advances today, but what other programs can we run utilizing that back end? That's what I'm interested in as well.
Yeah. I love this next section. I call it my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we go. First things up is I always like to open it up with, what's particularly hard about your job day to day?
Oh, I am an engineer at heart. So I think that the most important thing of the company are the people.
Yeah.
But that can also be quite a challenge, right? Especially for someone with my brain. So learning that process is really important to me. And so getting the coaching and the mentoring I need to make that happen, super important.
Yeah. I always like to ask founders, what's one thing that, you're particularly better at now that you wish you were better at earlier on in your career?
Understanding the value of maintaining relationships with other parties, I think is the biggest thing. I underweighted that for a long time. And I learned that really from my co-founder, actually, right? Just touching base, because you never know when you're going to need someone else's support. So I think that's one of the biggest things to me.
Yeah. Do you do that in a very direct way? So like a lot of people will have an investor board and they kind of continue with email updates, or is it content driven? Is it something where you're building a relationship with the community? What ways have you been able to kind of keep, I guess, in contact with those who are around or involved in somewhat aspect of your business who may find value in it later on?
All of the things you've just mentioned are great. But I think that one of the big things that came out of going through the COVID pandemic was just actually being able to spend some face-to-face time with someone. Right.
Yeah.
So making that conference trip that you don't want to go to, but you know that certain people are going to be there. So just showing up and having a presence with them. is something that I definitely underrated early on.
Yeah, yeah. I always like to speculate with certain questions, but in terms of what having access to digital currency and digital economy, whether it's domestically or globally, in terms of how it affects entrepreneurs, what do you think its effect going to be in terms of the investing environment? Being that obviously we've seen a huge shift. A lot of companies are not investing in users anymore. They're investing in profitable businesses or businesses with predictable revenues and who have some kind of maturity. But even going kind of expanding upon that as companies are investing into different markets and people have access to funds and and resources and things like that. How do you think that changes the landscape, being that a lot of companies will probably start adopting more digital currency to transact with businesses? How does that shift the paradigm with investment? How does that change the landscape? Just pure speculation, but I'm curious if what your opinion is seeing what you have seen.
I think the big change is actually going to be expanding, or to put it another way, democratizing the investor class, right? Because to be able to invest, particularly in growth startups, you have to have either certain contacts, a certain amount of money, and maybe you have to be classed as a sophisticated investor. There's regulatory hoops there as well. There's a lot of sort of crowdfunding platforms that have appeared in recent years, and I think that's some ways towards it. But having the ability to raise some sort of money or create vehicles in the digital currency space, of course, there's still going to be regulations that might apply there, but I think that's going to open the door for a lot more people to be investing. And then that will influence ultimately who ends up getting invested into. So I think that's going to be the biggest change, and probably the biggest spotlight shone by regulators maybe in a few years as well.
Yeah, yeah. Outside of obviously what you're doing now, what is an area within blockchain that the technology has, say, not tapped into that you're particularly excited about? You're kind of keeping a watch on in terms of how it's going to affect, say, a certain industry or certain product. What in particular have you seen out there that you're particularly excited about? Maybe not working on at Stronghold, but auxiliary or adjacent, or at least in your kind of rear view.
Yeah, something I used to hear a lot about actually. So people were definitely thinking about it. I'm sure they are now. But it was when IoT was the
Yeah.
phrase that used to hear all the time. And I think that the ability to have devices, and now AI is in the mix again, right?
Yeah.
So maybe AI enabled or aware IoT devices that are now controlling their own currencies or
Yeah.
their own wallets. I think that's super interesting. And I'm surprised that I haven't heard quite as much about that recently. I'm sure there's a lot of people working on it because that's going to be huge.
Yeah.
So definitely eyes on that space, how AI or devices might be able to make payments and get access to resources, right? Just join the economy as their own entities.
Yeah. How has AI affected your business, or do you see it affecting your business at all, kind of moving forward?
And we actually just talked about this at our company meeting yesterday. It's come up a few times. Yeah, there's certainly use for it in a software org, right? Have engineers using GitHub Copilot, right? We're still trying to think about the best uses for it. Right now, I'll use it to read and write emails, right? Because that saves me a bunch of time. But beyond that, it's still early days for us trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it all feels so new and it's evolving so quickly. But yeah, we're definitely looking at that.
yeah. You said it helps you read and write emails more quickly. Do you have any productivity tools that you're keeping secret?
I'm pretty simple. I have a to-do list. My email inbox is my main to-do list, to be honest, and then
Sure.
ChatGPT on the side.
Yeah.
That's it. Keep it simple, right? I don't want too many things to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I always like to ask this question because I love how founders extract knowledge out of anything that they ingest, whether it's early in your career or now. What books or people have really influenced you the most?
You know, for me, I think that there's so much information. I felt like early on for me, it was information overload. And for that reason, I really relied on key people in my life. So finding mentors who have grown a business previously to sort of help me filter that through, and really just sitting down and spending time with them, understanding how they built their business. That's really how I went about learning early on. For me personally, having a bunch of books, it's just too much. It's overwhelming,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And one thing I actually I was going to ask before, but it just popped in my head is, as a CTO, somebody who's been around technology a lot, how do you see kind of like no code or low code kind of technology platforms and frameworks moving into blockchain? And is it moving at a more rapid rate than previously? And how is it? What are you excited about the ability for companies to adopt digital economy with these no code platforms and really kind of be very, I guess, what is the word for it? Scrappy in terms of how they kind of create business and things along that.
I love the look of those platforms, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the benefits of them. My main concern is, though, it's money at the end of the day, right? And money on blockchain is incredibly easy to lose. So I hope that there are big platforms that are really putting on, again, those guide rails or those training wheels to help developers understand that, or keep them from the dangers that maybe using sort of building block style or AI generated code. That's another worry there. It could lead to some losses, right? We've got the best engineers in the space writing smart contracts today, and money is disappearing. There's all over the place, right? Take that a level lower where someone's using building blocks to put that together, it's potentially dangerous. So that's one concern. However, the ability for more companies to be able to join the digital economy using these platforms, that's fantastic. So more outreach, great. That's really super, but I hope we're being careful.
Yeah. I always like to ask this. Founders don't really think about this, or they do, but if you weren't working on Stronghold, what would you be doing?
I'd probably be I'd probably be a doctor now. So
Yeah.
there we go.
There you go. There you go. At least you had a more clearly defined a career path than others, but I always like to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table here. Sean, I know we're coming to the close of the episode, but is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that we didn't cover that you wish we did, anything that we left on the table here today?
I think you've done a great job, Julian.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. And last little bit is, where can we find you for our audience sake? Where can we find you as a founder? What are your LinkedIns? What are your websites? What are your Twitters? And also, where can we find Stronghold and really start being a fan and up to date on where the technology is evolving? Where can we be supporters of you and the company?
Yeah, so Stronghold's links are all found at stronghold.co/social. That's stronghold.co/social. And my handle is, it's Sean Bennett on everywhere you can find me.
I love that, Sean. It's been such a pleasure learning about your background, your experience, but also Stronghold, kind of what the conception of the technology was, and what is it expanding to now, and what that really means for people who are looking to get access to financial services, but also really tackle the problems of remittance for those who have that issue. It's exciting to hear where the company is today, but also where it's going to in the next few years down the line. And I hope you enjoyed yourself on the show today, but thank you for joining us on Behind Company Lines.
Had a great time. Thanks for having me on.